Okay, Erev Tov, everybody. Pleasure to welcome making her debut, I guess, on Torn Motions or say, Devora Chait,
Hey,
Chait-Roth,
yeah.
I guess. Okay, I met her as Devora Chait. She's with her lives with her husband and young daughter, and as pursuing a PhD in computer science at NYU, I believe. She is a graduate of Midrash Lindenbaum and the GPATS program at Stern and is now learning at the Orator. That's the I guess the Lindenbaum program in Halacha, the scholars program in Halacha. And I was saying, if I can say, most importantly, a good friend of my daughter, Atara, which is and how we got you into Torah Motion. And it's a pleasure to welcome you. We can make a Shechayano, and Vakasha, it's all yours.
Okay, thank you so much. Hi, everyone. Very excited to be here. I'm going to speak tonight about the sort of the beginning of Parshat Re'eh. So I'll go ahead and share my screen. Oh, it's this one over here. Okay, does everyone see that? That's good?
Yes, we
Okay.
can see it.
Okay, great. Okay, so to start off, we're going to just see this is at the very beginning of Parshat Re'eh. And it's talking about various things that will happen when Bnei Yisrael, when the Jewish people enter into the land of Israel. So over here in this pasuk, Atem over Matei Yarden, Lavo Lareshet et Haaretz. So you're going to you're going to cross the Jordan River, you're going to come into the land to inherit the land that God gave you. Okay, and Moshe now is speaking to the whole Bnei Israel, to the Jewish people, and he's telling them they're going to have to keep all the commandments. And one of the first things that he's saying in this parsha is Abed ta'avduna kol hamikomot asher avdu sham hagoyim. So you need to destroy all the places that the non-Jews who were living in Israel before where they worshiped. So you're going to come into the land of Israel. You're going to find altars all over the place. You're going to find places of worship everywhere. You have to destroy all of those places. And then we come to this pasuk. Lo tasun kain laHashem Elokechem. Don't do that to Hashem your God. Now, you read this pasuk and you're sort of like, don't do what, right? Right before Moshe said, destroy all the places where the non-Jews worship. Don't do that to Hashem your God. Okay, so what does that mean? So if we keep reading, if we read the next pasuk, it says, Ki im el hamakom asher yibchar Hashem Elokechem mikol shivtechem. So you need to only go to the place that Hashem your God chose from all of your tribes. Asum et shemo sham, et shemo sham l'shechno tidrashu uvata shama. Okay, so God is going to choose some place out of all the tribes, and there you're going to have to go to seek God out. So putting these together, Moshe says, you come into the land, you're going to have to destroy all of these places of worship of the non-Jews that you find everywhere. Don't do that. Rather, God is going to choose one place for you, and you're all going to have to go to that one place. That's where you're going to bring all your sacrifices. Okay, so it becomes clear that at least in the understanding, the surface understanding of the pasuk, the clearest understanding is when Moshe says, don't do this to Hashem your God, he means don't worship everywhere like all of the non-Jews did. And if we go down over here to this Rashi, on this pasuk lo tasun kain, he says, you shouldn't be, burning incense. You shouldn't be sacrificing to God just in any place that you want. You have to only go to one place, to the place that God chooses. Now, it doesn't say in these pasukim where God chooses. It says God will choose a place. But we generally understand this to mean Jerusalem, where the Beit HaMikdash, or the temple, is going to be built. Now, if we look through the psukim more, it sort of drives this point home further. It says, the place that you're going to go to, the place that God chose, that's where you're going to bring everything that I'm commanding you, all of your different kinds of sacrifices, anything that you need to give to God, you have to go to Jerusalem. And then we say again, Hishamer lecha, be very careful. Lest you bring sacrifices anywhere. You have to only bring your sacrifices to the place that God chooses. Now, from these pasukim, it seems pretty clear that we have to bring our sacrifices to one designated spot. We absolutely cannot be bringing them all over the place, which makes this next part that I'm going to say pretty surprising. Uh-oh, my mouse stopped working. Okay, we're going to, oh, it's back. Okay, I'm going to come back to some psukim that I sort of just skipped over, tried to not let anyone notice. But what we say over here, what Moshe says is, Lo tasun kechol asher anachnu osim po hayom, ish kol hayashar beinav. So just the simple understanding of that is Moshe saying, don't do like we're doing today, where everyone does whatever is right in their eyes. Ki lo batem ad ata el hamnucha ve'el hanachala asher Hashem okecha notein lach. Because you haven't yet reached the resting place and the inheritance that Hashem, your God, gave to you. Now, it's not very clear from just the basic understanding of the psukim what this is talking about. And, actually delving into how to break down this pasuk in the context of the rest is a little bit tricky. I'm actually not going to go into that. But we learned a very, very important halacha, a very important law from these psukim. And I'm going to go to Rashi to introduce this. So Rashi says, Lo tasun kechol asher anachnu osim. Musav lamala. So Rashi saying these words are taking us back to how we started. Al ki atem over matayardin. It's really a continuation of the sentence that you're going to cross the Jordan River. Okay, and what is it trying to tell us? When you cross the Jordan River, you're immediately allowed to bring sacrifices on a bama. Okay, now what is a bama? A bama just refers to any place where you sacrifice that's not the Beit HaMikdash, that's not the temple, or the Mishkan, the tabernacle. And over here, we're like, what? How is that possible? Right? We just spent so many pesukim over here, over and over and over again, saying you have to sacrifice only in the place that God tells you. You can't bring your sacrifices everywhere. And here we are, right in the middle of this, learning from these pesukim. Where'd they go? Oh, here, learning from these pesukim that actually, when you cross the Jordan River, you can bring sacrifices wherever you want. Now, this is not going to last. Rashi is going to qualify this. And he says, Kol arba asrei shana shal kibush v'chiluk. It's, when does this apply? This applies during the 14 years of conquering the land and dividing up the land. Okay, now that is referring to right after they crossed the Jordan River. They spent 14 years conquering the land from the non-Jews who were living there and giving out the different portions of land. And then they relocated the Mishkan to Shiloh. And then, the rest of Navi sort of happened. So the very surprising halacha that we're learning over here is that once they cross the Jordan, there's a 14-year period where you actually can bring sacrifices anywhere. And actually, if we look at this Mishnah in Zvachim, it wasn't just a 14-year period. Okay, so let's look at the Mishnah. So the Mishnah said, in source 3, An shelo hukam hamishkan haya habamo mutarot. So before the Mishkan was ever built, you could sacrifice anywhere. And this sort of makes sense because there was no Mishkan, there was no central place to bring any sacrifices. Do it wherever you want. Mishahu kam hamishkan nesru habamot. So once the Mishkan was established, no more bamot. And that's consistent with what we saw in the psukim. Ba'u Gilgal, the hutru habamot. So when they came to Gilgal, this is what Rashi was referring to, when they crossed the Jordan and they had those 14 years of conquering. Bamot were allowed. Ba'u Shiloh, so they went to Shiloh and they established the Mishkan there. Nesru habamot. Okay, the bamot were forbidden again. Okay, now it describes Shiloh a little bit. And then it says, Ba'u no v'givon hutru habamot. So no v'givon is referring to a time period after Shiloh. So there was the Mishkan at Shiloh. Then Shiloh was destroyed. The Aron was captured. The Ark was captured. And they sort of had temporary spots to keep their Mishkan. And during that time, once Shiloh was destroyed, bamot were allowed again. So this is another time that bamot were allowed. Ba'u Yerushalayim nesru habamot v'lo haya od lahem heter. Okay, so once they came to Yerushalayim, once they set up the Beit HaMikdash, then bamot were forbidden once and for all. You can no longer sacrifice anywhere. Never again are we allowed to do that. And I made this nice little timeline over here. Hopefully this will help. everybody visualize what's happening. It's a back and forth, back and forth. So from the time they left Egypt until the Mishkan was built, we can have bamot, we can sacrifice anywhere, which makes sense. There was no central place to bring our sacrifices. Then once the Mishkan was built, then bamot were forbidden. So now you have to bring your sacrifices to one central place, the Mishkan. Once we cross the Yarden, bamot are allowed again, astonishingly, until we have the Mishkan established at Shiloh. And then at that point, you have to bring your sacrifices to Shiloh. Bamot are not allowed. Then the Mishkan is destroyed. Bamot are allowed again. You can sacrifice wherever you want up until the Beit HaMikdash is built in Yerushalayim, until the temple is built in Jerusalem. Okay, now how do we get this back and forth, right? If we're looking at the psukim, it seems pretty clear no bamot. Then Rashi said, there was one time when bamot were allowed, and now the Mishnah is saying actually there were a few times when you could sacrifice anywhere. So where does this come from? It actually comes from that pasuk that we read earlier. Kilo batem ad ata el hamnucha el hanachala asher Hashem elokecha notein lach, because you haven't arrived yet at the resting place, menucha, and the inheritance, the nachala that Hashem your God gave you. And the way that we understand this pasuk is you can do bamot, you can sacrifice anywhere once you cross the Jordan River, because you haven't yet arrived at the menucha or the nachala, the resting place or the inheritance. Once you get there, whatever that is, bamot will no longer be permitted. You can't sacrifice anywhere. You have to go to the mikdash. So let's see how this is learned out in the Gemara. So this is the continuation of the Mishnah. This is the Gemara in Zvachim. And it says, Tanur Rabbanan. So our rabbis taught, Kilo batem ad adam nucha v'al nachala. So that's that pasuk that we just read. You hadn't yet reached the resting place or the inheritance. Menucha zu Shiloh, nachala zu Yerushalayim. So menucha, resting place, is referring to Shiloh, when the Mishkan was set up at Shiloh. Nachala, inheritance, is referring to Yerushalayim, to the temple in Jerusalem. And we say in between, bamot were allowed. So that's how we end up with this timeline, right? So Shiloh is the menucha. So once we establish the Mishkan at Shiloh, no more bamot. And once we establish the Beit HaMikdash in Jerusalem, no more bamot. And in between, bamot are allowed. Now, that's what the Mishnah said. But there's actually a bunch of different opinions on how to read menucha and nachala. So we're going to go through that now. And this is really what I'm interested in. Okay, so the first opinion was Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda said menucha is Shiloh, nachala is Yerushalayim. Rabbi Shimon says, no, menucha is Yerushalayim, nachala is Shiloh. So when the pasuk says you can do bamot, you can sacrifice anywhere because you haven't yet arrived at the resting place, the menucha, or the inheritance, the nachala. Menucha is referring to Yerushalayim. Nachala is referring to Shiloh. The resting place is the temple in Jerusalem, and the inheritance is the tabernacle at Shiloh. So they sort of say the same thing, but we're switching around what is what. And I'm going to skip over this. We're going to talk about that a little bit later. There's a third opinion, Rabbi Yishmael. Rabbi Yishmael says, no, zu v'zu Shiloh. Menucha and nachala, both words, are referring to the Mishkan at Shiloh. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai says, no, zu v'zu Yerushalayim. They're both referring to Yerushalayim. We're not talking about Shiloh at all. Okay, I'm going to pause here. We're going to look at a chart because I know that was like a lot of information, a lot of different opinions, all arguing about just like a couple of options. So here's a nice chart. We're going to focus first on this part of the chart. So what does menucha mean and what does nachala mean? So we have this argument. Is it Shiloh? Is it Jerusalem? Is it just one or the other? Okay, so we have all of our opinions. Rabbi Yehuda says menucha is Shiloh, nachala is Jerusalem. Rabbi Shimon switches it. Rabbi Yishmael says they're both Shiloh, and Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai says they're both Jerusalem. Now, what does this mean for us? Why do we care? So if the pasuk says you can do bamot right now, you can sacrifice wherever you are because you have not yet reached menucha or nachala. So what we need to translate that to in our head is you can sacrifice wherever you want. Bamot are allowed up until the Menucha time and the Nachla time. So now we're going to start having differences in opinion on when we were allowed to sacrifice wherever we want. So we're going to go one by one here. For Rabbi Yehuda says Menucha is Shiloh. So what does that mean? Once you cross the Jordan River, you can sacrifice wherever you want because you haven't yet reached Shiloh. Okay, so you can sacrifice wherever you want until Shiloh. Then once Shiloh is gone, you can sacrifice wherever you want because you haven't reached Jerusalem. Okay, so that means up until from between Shiloh and Jerusalem, Bama will be allowed, but once you reach Jerusalem, no more Bama. Okay, for Rabbi Shimon, we end up with the same thing, but his order is reversed. The Gemara talks about that, but we're not going to go into that tonight. But it's the same thing. So up until Shiloh, Bama were allowed. Shiloh, they were not allowed. And then after Shiloh, the Bama were allowed again. Jerusalem, not allowed. Rabbi Yishmael has sort of what looks like a stricter opinion. So you can sacrifice, the pasuk now says, you can sacrifice wherever you want until you reach Shiloh. Shiloh twice. Okay, really until you reach Shiloh. I'm just going to talk about the surface level understanding of Rabbi Yishmael here, which is until Shiloh, Bama were allowed. Once we hit Shiloh, Bama are never allowed again. And then we have this last opinion, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai reads the pasuk to say, you can sacrifice wherever you want until you've reached Jerusalem. And now we get a big difference. Now what Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is saying is that Bamot, you can sacrifice wherever you want. They're allowed all the way up until we establish the Mikdash, until we have the Beit HaMikdash in Jerusalem, in Yerushalayim. And now we're going to have a big difference of opinion. And the big difference of opinion lies in this question. What happened during the time of the Mishkan? Were the Jews allowed to sacrifice wherever they want? Or were they obligated to bring all of their sacrifices to the Mishkan? And three of the opinions here hold that during Shiloh, Bamot were not allowed. Bamot were forbidden. You cannot sacrifice wherever you want. You have to bring Bamot. You have to bring your sacrifices to the Mishkan. And this last opinion, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai says, no. During Shiloh, while there was a Mishkan, you could still sacrifice wherever you want. I know that there's a place where you can bring everything. You can go to the Mishkan, but you're allowed to sacrifice anywhere. Now, the first thing I want to do over here is understand this debate because this seems like a major difference. We have three people who hold that during the times of the Mishkan in Shiloh, you could not sacrifice anywhere you want. You have to go to the Mishkan. And you have one opinion who says, no, you can sacrifice wherever you want during the times of the Mishkan. Now, I just first want to explain a little bit what was going on at the Mishkan in Shiloh. So when the Jews were in the desert, wandering in the Midbar, they had the tabernacle, they had the Mishkan, and it would travel around with them. And during that time, they had to bring their sacrifices to the Mishkan, to the tabernacle. There's one central place. You have to bring your sacrifices there. Once they crossed the Jordan, so there wasn't really a set spot, let's say, for the Mishkan. They were allowed to sacrifice anywhere. And then during Shiloh, they established the Mishkan again. So whereas before the Mishkan, during the times of the Midbar, of the wandering in the desert, the tabernacle traveled with them and everybody had to bring sacrifices to the Mishkan. So now again in Shiloh, we establish a spot for the Mishkan. There's a set Mishkan. Okay, and these three opinions say, look at that. There's a set Mishkan. There's a set tabernacle. There's a place where you have to bring your sacrifices. You can't bring Bamo. You can't sacrifice on Bamo. You can't sacrifice anywhere you want. There's a place to go. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai says, I know that there was a Mishkan, but you can still sacrifice anywhere you want. So what's going on here? What are they arguing So the first thing that I want to think about is the majority side, is the side that Bamot were not allowed during the Mishkan of Shiloh. Now, I think intuitively this makes sense because there's a location. But I think that we need to flesh out that intuition a little bit more. We have to say to ourselves, well, what is it that's intuitive, right? Why shouldn't we be allowed to sacrifice anywhere? And for this, I want to bring the Meiri, who is a commentator on the Gemara. And the Meiri presents sort of a grand theory for when Bamot were allowed, when we were allowed to sacrifice anywhere, and for when Bamot were not allowed, when we couldn't sacrifice just anywhere and we have to go to Yerushalayim. So the Meiri said, well, I'm going to skip over here. 1 second. Okay. Ukvar noda lanu mimasechet Zvachim. So we know from the Gemara in Zvach. This is actually on another source in Megillah. We're going to see it later. But he's saying, well, we know from Zvachim, she'ad shelo hukam hamishkan hutru habamot. So up until the Mishkan was established, you were allowed to sacrifice anywhere. Bamot were allowed. Umisha hukam hamishkan nesru. And once the Mishkan was established, Bamot were not allowed. You had to bring your sacrifices to the Mishkan. Why? So here's his grand theory. Hoyo b'haya sham mizbeach v'aron imo. Because the Mizbeach was there with the Aron with it. So the altar was there and the ark was with the altar. The Aron was with the Mizbeach at the Mishkan in Shiloh. At the Mishkan in the Midbar. Ba'u Gilgal. So now they crossed the Yarden, they crossed the Jordan River. Kol sheva shekivshu v'sheva shechalku. So during the 7 years of conquering, the 7 years of dividing the land. So where was the Aron? What was happening? He says, V'haya ha'aron holech imam b'milchamotehem. The Aron traveled with them when they went out to war. They took the ark with them out to war. Below haya kavua im hamizbeach begilgal. Hutru habamo. The mizbeach, the altar, was not set as established with them in Gilgal, where they were staying after they crossed the Jordan. So since the ark was not established with the mizbeach, since the ark was not established with the altar, they were taking the ark, they were taking the Aron out to fight their wars. Bamot are allowed. Okay, so he's saying something about how you need the ark with the altar, you need the Aron with the mizbeach. If the Aron is with the mizbeach, no Bamot. If the Aron is separated, yes Bamot. And he goes again. Ba'u l'Shilo, achar chaluka haaretz, ba'amad ha'aron kavuam hamizbeach, nesru habamot. So they came to Shiloh, they established the Mishkan at Shiloh after they divided up the land. And now the Aron, the ark, was established, set with the altar, with the Mizbeach. Aron plus Mizbeach, ark plus altar, no Bamot. Ba'u l'no v'givon, so now they come after Shiloh, after the Mishkan at Shiloh was destroyed. Hutru habamot, Bamot are allowed. Why? So he sort of goes through the whole series of what's happening over here. But long story short, since the Aron ends up not being with the Mizbeach after the Mishkan at Shiloh was destroyed, Bamot are allowed. You could sacrifice wherever you want. So they came to Jerusalem, they built the Beit HaMikdash, the temple, and they established everything in its place. So they put the Aron, the ark, with the Mizbeach, with the altar. Bamot were not allowed. Below Haitel and Od Hatter, and Bamot were never allowed again. You were never allowed to sacrifice wherever you want. When I read this Meiri, I thought it was totally bizarre. I can understand saying there's one central place and that's where you have to bring your sacrifices. But what I don't understand is why the Meiri says, oh, you can bring your sacrifices wherever you want when the Aron is not with the Mizbeach. When the ark is not with the altar, you can bring your sacrifices anywhere you want. If the Aron is with the Mizbeach, that's when you're not allowed. That's when you have to bring your sacrifices to one place. Why? Like what does the Aron being near the Mizbeach have to do with whether or not you have to bring sacrifices? Right? So why is the Aron at all important? So first of all, I'm happy to take any thoughts. If anybody wants to chime in here, happy to take thoughts. I'm also happy to, jump right into what I'm thinking. But if anybody has any thoughts, I could pause for a minute, see if anybody has any ideas on why the Aron being next to the Mizbeach should make a difference in whether you could bring sacrifices. Why should it be that when the Aron is with the Mizbeach, you need to bring it there? When the Aron is not with the Mizbeach, doesn't matter, sacrifice wherever you want. I'll pause.
I was wondering whether the prohibition of lo ta'asun kain for Hashem Elokecha is a prohibition of destroying kosher bamot that were built for Hashem and not for Avodah Zarah.
So that's very, very interesting. So there are people who a lot of explanations of that pasuk is that you can't destroy Shem Hashem. You can't destroy anything that has God's name. I'm not sure though about bamot that were built for Avodah Zarah. It's a good question. I'll look into that. Okay, so I'll pause for another second if anyone has any thoughts on this Aron Mizbeach thing. Okay, so I also really had no idea until I was reading Rav Hirsch. So Rav Hirsch on our Parsha has a really, really nice interpretation of the prohibition of bamot, of bringing sacrifices anywhere. And he's not directly commenting on the Meiri, but I think that we can use him to explain the Meiri. So what Rav Hirsch speaks about is the power of the Mizbeach, the power of sacrifices on the altar. And what he says is that the power of the Mizbeach is that the Jewish people can tap into a promise that God made them. And the promise that God made them is that when they bring their sacrifices, it will give them atonement. God will accept the sacrifices and will atone for their sins. But when is that promise made? The promise, Rav Hirsch says, is only made to Bnei Yisrael as a nation. And when they're connected to the covenant, to the Brit that God made with them at Har Sinai, at Sinai. Now, how do we connect to the covenant? Well, we have to bring our sacrifices as a nation in the context of our peoplehood. If we don't have a connection to that promise, to our identity as peoplehood, all that we are is individuals. And when we're lacking in that connection to our peoplehood and we're just a bunch of individuals, it doesn't really matter where you sacrifice wherever you want. You're never going to get that promise of atonement. You just have to try your best as your own individual person. And that's when bamot will be allowed. That's when we'll say you could sacrifice wherever you want. Because you're just you don't have it. There's no shot at tapping into that national covenant anyway. You're just a bunch of individuals. Now, tying this back into the Meiri, how do we achieve that national identity? How do we connect our sacrifices with the promise that God made us at Har Sinai, at Sinai, that our sacrifices as a nation will be accepted? We can tap into that when the Aron is with the Mizbeach. The Aron, the ark, contains the tablets, the Luchot HaBrit, which is representative of this covenant. Now, without those tablets, without the Aron, all that we have is an altar. But once the altar is connected to the ark, once the Mizbeach is with the Aron, with the Luchot, so now we're characterizing the Mizbeach as one of this national covenant, of this promise that God made us. And I think this is the Meiri's understanding, is that whenever we have the Mizbeach and the Aron, whenever our sacrifices are connected to the Brit, through the Aron, through the Luchot, then of course you can't sacrifice anywhere else, because your sacrifice will be lacking. Our sacrifices need to be part of that covenant, of that Brit that God made with us. that promised that he'll atone for us when we sacrifice. So we can't bring sacrifices wherever we want. We can't have bamot because we're going to be lacking in our karbanos, in our sacrifices. But if the aron is separate from the mizbeach, if the ark is unattached to the altar, so now our sacrifices don't connect us to that brit, to that covenant anyway. We don't have the luchot. We don't have the tablets that God gave us that represent the brit. Okay, so once we're not connected anyway, it doesn't really matter. All of our sacrifices will lack. You can bring them wherever you want. I think that this understanding of the aron and the mizbeach, this understanding that informs this idea about bamot. So I think this can really explain well these opinions that say that during the time of Mishkan Shiloh, bamot were forbidden. Because during the time of the Mishkan, so that's what the Meiri is saying, that the ark was with the altar, the aron was with the mizbeach. So of course you can't have bamot then. Of course you can't sacrifice wherever you want. You're going to be losing out on connecting your sacrifice to the brit. Okay, maybe when there's no aron, so do whatever you want. But of course, during Mishkan Shiloh, bamot are not allowed because your karbanot, your sacrifices, will be lacking. Now I want to think a little bit more about this last opinion, that during the time of the Mishkan, bamot were allowed. Because I feel like I've really convinced myself that when we have Shiloh, when we have the aron with the mizbeach, you can't sacrifice wherever you want. So what is Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai thinking? How can he possibly say that during Mishkan Shiloh you could sacrifice wherever you want? What does he think the Mishkan in Shiloh was lacking? Right? He must think when we sacrificed, even if we went to the Mishkan in Shiloh, it wouldn't be the full deal. Right? So who cares? Bring it wherever you want. So what does Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai think is lacking? Now, to open this up, I want to give us a new timeline. This is the timeline according to Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Okay, so let's see. What does he think happened? He thinks before the Mishkan, bamot were allowed. And then this whole time, up until, this whole time, up until, this should have moved over. Sorry. He thinks this whole time up until the temple was built in Jerusalem, bamot were allowed again. Ooh, you know what? Nobody look at this chart. It's very confusing. I made it totally wrong. We're going to go back up here. What does Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai think? I'll just use words. He thinks that from the time we crossed the Jordan River all the way until the Mikdash was established, the Beit HaMikdash was built in Jerusalem, sacrifice wherever you want. The only times that the bamot were not allowed was in the Midbar, in the desert, when we had the Mishkan, and once we built the Beit HaMikdash. Now, what this seems to me is that for Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, there's some quality in those two times, in the Mishkan that we had when we were wandering in the desert, and in the Beit HaMikdash, that the Mishkan and Shiloh simply did not have. And that this quality is going to be what requires us to come to the temple. Okay, I'm going to delete this confusing chart. Here we go. Now, I think that the Rambam is going to be able to help us here. So this Rambam is in the Perush HaMishnah, with the Rambam on the Mishnah, and he's talking about that first prohibition of bringing bamot, of sacrificing wherever you want when we were wandering in the desert. Okay, so what does he say? He says, so when they were by the Jordan River, once they crossed, there was no established temple. They just sort of had the tabernacle there. They had the Mishkan there hanging out. Aval, kevan shehalashon be'eser habamot ne'emar taloi b'machaneh. Since the prohibition of bamot, of sacrificing wherever you want, in the Midbar, when they were out in the wilderness, is dependent on this idea of machaneh, camp. Hooray! So hare im chasul hamachano, when they were lacking in this idea of a camp, the kanisa tam la'aretz, and they entered the land, when they were in Gilgal, nistalik halav hazev v'nishar ha'ater. The prohibition was removed and the allowance remained. So what is he saying over here? He's saying the whole idea of the prohibition of bringing sacrifices anywhere you want is all dependent on this idea of machane, of an encampment. Now, what does that mean? So here's just the psukim that he was talking about, if anybody wants to see. But let's see what he's talking about over here. So this is the Rambam in Hilchot Beit HaBechira. So this is where he's talking about the laws of the temple of the Beit HaMikdash. And he says like, Shalosh Machano Hayu Bamidbar. There were 3 encampments in the desert. Machane Yisrael, so an encampment of the general people. Umachane Levia, an encampment of the Levi, the tribe of Levi. Shenemar ba v'saviv l'mishkan yachanu, so they camped around the Mishkan. Umachane Shechina, and the encampment of God, so to speak. V'hu miftach chatzar ohamoy v'livnim, mipetach chatzar ohamoy v'livnim, from the outside of the Mishkan, all the way into the inside. So there are 3 spheres. There's the Machane Yisrael, where all the Jews encamped. Inside of that is a Machane Levi, an encampment of the Shevet Levi. And inside of that is a Machane Shechina, is the encampment of God, so to speak, where the Mishkan was. And now what does the Rambam say? The Kenegdan Lidoro. And mirroring these 3 encampments is what we have eternally. Mipetach Yerushalayim al Har Habayit Kamachane Yisrael. So from the entrance of Jerusalem until the Har Habayit, the Temple Mount, is like that outer encampment of the general population of the Jews. Mipetach Har Habayit ad Petach HaAzara Shushar Niknor Kamachane Levia. So from the entrance to Temple Mount to Har Habayit until essentially the start of the temple, that's like the Levi encampment. And then Mipetach Hazara v'lifnim Machane Shechina. And then from a certain part of the Beit HaMikdash all the way inside, that's like the encampment of God, so to speak. So the Rambam is telling us over here, when he's talking about the prohibition of sacrificing wherever you want, that the whole idea of the prohibition against sacrificing wherever you want when they were in the desert is because they had a machana, they had an encampment. And then he's telling us in Beit HaBechira, just like the encampment in the desert, likewise, we had an encampment in Jerusalem. Now, what does that even mean? What is an encampment in Jerusalem? So what the Rambam is really trying to get across over here is that there were spheres of Kedusha, there were spheres of holiness. When they were in the Midbar, in the wilderness, their whole encampment was centered around the Mishkan. And the Mishkan created areas of Kedusha, areas of holiness. Likewise, when we built the Beit HaMikdash, the establishment of the Beit HaMikdash also consecrated the area around it in these spheres of Kedusha, these spheres of holiness. And now I want to think about Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. So Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai had said during the time of Mishkan Shiloh, you could sacrifice wherever you want. And we asked, what is lacking in the Mishkan Shiloh? Why should you be able to bring sacrifices wherever you want? I think that we could use the Rambam to understand Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. What was lacking in the Mishkan Shiloh is this idea of machaneh, was this idea that the Mishkan or the Mikdash that you've established has an impact on its surroundings. That the center of the sacrifices, the center of where they worship, also consecrates the surrounding area. Now, during the Mishkan of Shiloh, there was no such thing. Right? There was sort of just an area where people go to sacrifice. They had the Mishkan, but it had no impact on the location around it. I think over there, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is saying that's incomplete. There's something incomplete about the Kedusha, about the holiness of Shiloh. And since it's only a partial holiness, since it doesn't have this impact on its surroundings, so you're never going to get the full effect of the sacrifices there anyway. So sacrifice wherever you want. But when we come to Jerusalem, then we've regained that idea of machana. We've regained this situation where our temple is so, it's a center of Kedusha such that it even consecrates the area around it. And only then, that's when we have the complete expression of sacrifices, the complete expression of karbanot. And once we have the complete expression of karbanot, then you can't sacrifice it. So I'm happy to pause over here, take any questions. I have one more interesting piece of the Gemara in Zvachim that I'd like to go over, but I can pause for questions if anyone has any. All right.
I have one
Yeah, sure.
kind of question comment there. I'm just thinking that, the Sukkim that you started with has the verse Babakom Asher Hashem Yireh. I mean, that's always in a Tanakh perspective or a Torah perspective talking about Yerushalayim. So we know that there's an inherent sanctity in Yerushalayim itself. So the nature of any karban from that perspective probably is of a lesser value if it's not brought in Yerushalayim, that there's something inherent about bringing a sacrifice in Yerushalayim because that is the chosen place. So that maybe that's part of Reb Shimon's thought about that it's Yerushalayim as opposed to Shiloh or anywhere else that has, will enhance the acceptance of the korban.
Yeah, so that's a really nice point. Actually, somewhat totally surprising. I believe Rashi over here says, oh, first we're talking about Shiloh, and then we're talking about Yerushalayim. I may be mistaken. I have to look that up afterwards. Rav Soloveitchik also seems to say Shiloh could have been the final place. So there's definitely what to think about over there. But this next Gemara that we're going to do does drive home that point you're talking about, that there is a difference in Kedusha between Shiloh and Yerushalayim. Now, Shiloh was temporary, and Yerushalayim is the one that lasted. It is ultimately the place that God chose. So, yeah, but it's a good thought.
Are we saying that David got the concept of Jerusalem from God? No, I think he picked it because it was in no man's, between people's territory. But it always bothered me that nowhere do we find that God is pointing to any particular place.
Yeah, that is a great point, and I think we're actually going to get to that. If I can make it to this last thing, I don't know if I will, but it is a really good point. Is, well, who really did choose it? So hopefully we'll be able to touch on that, and if I don't, then I'll try to squish it in at the end. Yeah.
Because of all this, all the bamot that they were allowed to bring korbanot to you afterwards, it was so embedded that it was very hard to undo it. Look how hard it was to take them away from the bamot. Even if they meant it for Hashem, and it was L'Shem Shamayim, Chizkiyahu and some of the good kings tried to do it, Yoshiyahu, and they had so much trouble getting rid of it.
Yeah, that is interesting. Is maybe was this sort of a mistake to allow people to sacrifice anywhere? If it's hard to uproot that, it's a good question. That's a good question. We're not going to take that up. That's a very good question. Okay, so I'm going to try to get to this last part over here.
Before you go into the last part,
yes.
You are referring all the time to the word machane.
Sorry? Say again?
You are referring a lot to the word machane.
Wait 1 second. I can't fully hear this question. If anybody heard and can repeat, I would appreciate it.
the word you're referred before in the paragraph that you read before, you said all the time the word machane.
Yes, yes.
Is the camp, with the camp.
And
So are you relating to the Achdut that was in the Machane?
That's interesting. So I didn't think about Achdut really. I really was thinking about the idea that a Machane has Kedusha, that there is a location that is sanctified. And that's how the Rambam really speaks about the Machane in other places, is a Machane, it indicated a level of holiness. In each sphere, you couldn't, there were certain levels of purity that were required. And that's why I'm thinking about it in terms of the sacrifices. But the idea of Achdut is also very nice if you want to think back to the Rav Hirsch about
because it was, remember, in the 40 years, there was no one location, but it was one Machane.
Yes, it is very interesting.
It was not, you cannot talk about a physical place. At the time of the 40 years wandering from place to place, you cannot talk about a physical place. The only thing what you can refer to Machane is the unity that was there within all the Shvatim. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. Okay, I'm going to try to get to this last bit over here. We have like a little under 15 minutes. Okay, so before we had these opinions, I'll go back to the screen over here, and we split them up like this: the opinions that say that bamot were not allowed during the time of Shiloh, and the opinion that says that they were. But the Gemara actually also splits them up differently. The Gemara looks at these and says, oh, Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon both say one, we were trying to understand the words menucha and nachala. So the Gemara says Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon each think menucha refers to Shiloh or Yerushalayim, nachala refers to Shiloh or Yerushalayim, right? But they're both sort of doing the same thing. One is Shiloh, one is Yerushalayim. Which one? Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai both say, no, they're both Shiloh or they're both Yerushalayim. And I want to take the last few minutes to think about this distinction, this breakdown. Now, to do this, first we're going to think a little bit about these two opinions, Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, and then we're going to come back to these two. Okay, so let's first think about Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, Shiloh and Jerusalem. We're going to go back to the Gemara and come back to this part that I had skipped over before, which is the reasoning, what informs each of their opinions. Okay, so we're going to do first over here, let's see, Rabbi Yishmael. So Rabbi Yishmael had said, Menucha and Nachla are both referring to Shiloh. Okay, so what informs this opinion? So he says, so the Gemara says, Zuvazu Shiloh. Menucha, what's Menucha? What's the rest? Denachu mikivush. They rested from conquering. Nachala depalgu hatam nachalo. Nachala is when they were in Shiloh. That's when they divided up the inheritance amongst Bnei Yisrael. So Menucha there refers to the rest from conquering. Nachala refers to dividing up inheritance. Both of them, so that's both about Shiloh. Rashbi, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai says both of them are Yerushalayim. So what does it mean? So Nachala is referring to Nachalat Olamim, is referring to how Jerusalem was chosen as an eternal place. And Menucha, so what is Menucha, the Gemara asks? Menuchat Aron, the resting of the Aron. So Nachala is the inheritance in terms of it being everlasting. Menucha is the resting of the Aron, both of them referring to Yerushalayim. Now, what do these two have in common? Well, they both seem to think that Menucha and Nachala are describing some kind of quality that makes Bamot usher, that makes Bamot forbidden. And I think that the quality that they're both getting at is stability. So let's think about that for a minute. So let's look at this first opinion, at Rabbi Yishmael's opinion, that they're both referring to Shiloh. So the two qualities, the two things that he's talking about are resting from conquering and dividing up the land. And the picture that comes to us is a picture of physical, political stability. They're done with conquering. They have the land. Everyone is where they're supposed to be. Everyone has their own portion. And now that we have that physical stability, so now Bamot are not allowed. And what Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai seems to be saying is, I think that he's talking about some kind of religious stability. We've chosen a place where God is going to rest eternally, where we're going to be set, the temple, the spot of the temple will be chosen eternally. And we've rested the Aron there. That's where the Ark of the Covenant, that's where the Aron HaBrit is going to stay. But I think that both of them are getting at this idea that when we're stable, either physically or religiously, so to speak, once we're in a stable state, we can't sacrifice anywhere that we want. Okay. And what does that sort of imply to us about Bamot? Well, what that implies is that Bamot are not ideal. We can have Bamot, we can sacrifice wherever we want when we're unstable, but once we're in a stable state, no more Bamot. They're suboptimal. When we're doing fine, you can't sacrifice wherever you want. Now, I think that the first two opinions are giving us something a little bit different than that. Now, the first two opinions seem to think that Shiloh and Yerushalayim are obviously what the pasuk is referring to. It's just a question of which one is which. And in Megillah, we're not going to spend so much time on this, but in Megillah, it speaks about the Kedusha of Shiloh and the Kedusha of Yerushalayim as part of this Isser Bamot. And what that sounds like is for Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon, why do they think, of course, we're talking about Shiloh and Jerusalem? Because those are the two areas of Kedusha, of holiness. Now, what does this tell us about Bamot? I think that this ends up telling us something a little bit different. I think that for both of them, Bamot are not inherently a bad thing. There isn't anything inherently wrong with sacrificing wherever you want, right? These last two opinions said sort of, unless you're super unstable, you have to go to the Mishkan, to the Mikdash, right? Bamot are like very suboptimal, only when you're in an unstable state. What Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon are saying is it's a positive thing. When you have a makom kedusha, when you have a place of holiness, so then you won't be able to have Bamot anymore. But if you don't have that, okay, so it's fine. Sacrifice wherever you want. There's not really anything wrong with it. And I think that this brings us back to this idea of Hamakom Asher Yipar Hashem, of God choosing a place. Now, I think that for them, there's not really anything so bad about sacrificing wherever you want. But what would be bad? What would be bad is if we detract from this idea, if we detract from the idea of everyone going to one place. Once we have a place that God has chosen, once we have a place, a central location for sacrificing, now Bamot will be inappropriate. Now it's inappropriate to sacrifice anywhere. Is it because there's something inherently wrong with sacrificing wherever you want? No. But once we have one central location, sacrificing in other places will negate that idea. It will negate that choice, that exclusivity. Now, for them, the only question that's left is, which one, of Menucha and Nachala, which one is Shiloh and which one is Yerushalayim. But for both of them, it's obvious that if you have a Makom Kedusha, Shiloh or Yerushalayim, you can't possibly have Bamot anymore because that will negate the idea of those places being holy. Is there anything inherently wrong with it? With sacrificing anywhere? No. But we can't afford to negate that idea of holiness. And now quickly, I just want to take a look at the psukim that they use, which is getting back to the question that someone asked before. They use very interesting psukim. They're both trying to figure out which one is Yerushalayim, Menucha or Nachala. So Rabbi Yehuda says Yerushalayim is Nachala. Why? He uses this pasuk from Yirmiyahu. And this pasuk in Yirmiyahu is actually a crazy pasuk. It's talking about how the Jewish people totally deserted God and God rejected them. But despite that, it still calls Jerusalem God's Nachala, God's inheritance. And I think this speaks to the idea that what makes Jerusalem so holy, so kadosh, it's our complete lack of ability to change anything about that status. It's not up to us. We pushed God away. We did our best to get out of this, right? But even so, Jerusalem stays the Nachala. What Rabbi Shimon uses is he uses a totally different pasuk. He says, no, he says Shiloh is the Nachala. Jerusalem is really Menucha. And why? Because of this pasuk. Zo Menuchati Yadei Ad, Po Ashev Ki Avitei. This is in Tehillim. And in Tehillim, in that parak, David describes how God promises him that he'll never abandon the house of David. And then says, and I'm going to rest in Jerusalem forever. Now, what does Jerusalem have to do with anything over there? So like someone brought up before, Jerusalem was chosen by David. And what this is telling us, I think what we're getting at in this source from Tehillim is that what makes Jerusalem holy? The fact that David chose it. In this parak of Tehillim, God is saying, I'm going to stay with David forever, and therefore I'm going to stay in Jerusalem. The holiest thing, what has the most power to sanctify a place is not our lack of ability to impact, but the precise opposite. It's our choice. When we chose a place to sacrifice, that makes it holy forever. And now that it's holy forever, so now that that place is chosen, we're not going to be able to sacrifice anywhere we want, because now we don't want to negate the Kedusha. But really, it's our actions that sanctify a place. I'm going to stop here. I think we're just about out of time. If anyone is interested, there's a very, very interesting source at the end in Megillah that brings an opinion that says that we can actually bring Bamot today. And there's a Tosfot that says, no, don't think you could read the opinion like that. Nobody thinks we can sacrifice wherever we want today. So that's a very interesting machloket to think about. If anybody wants to, happy to discuss afterwards with anyone too. But I think that, it's interesting for us to think about, what is ideal and what is unideal, and how our actions have the ability to really impact what we're allowed to do, what we're not allowed to do, and can give Kedusha in an everlasting way. Okay, thank you all so much. Happy to do any follow-up questions now. Thanks you all for having me.
Thank you.
All right, any questions, comments?
Okay, I see. Jess, should I do the chat questions, or we could wait for the
No,
live?
you can refer to anything in the chat if you want.
I don't think that Tehillim is something that we take as a source, an authoritative source for, it still bothers me that I don't have anything that God chose. I have no pasuk or whatever that, other than this and Tehillim saying that God chose that place and that's why David picked that, It's always bothered me.
Yeah, I totally hear that. I can try to follow up afterwards. I know Rav Menachem Liebtag talks about it a lot. The idea I was trying to bring from Tehillim is just, why did he choose that pasuk to say Yerushalayim is Menucha? I think that's what Rabbi Shimon thinks is the essence of the Kedusha of Yerushalayim, is that people chose it. But I can try to follow up. Look, Rav Menachem Liebtag talks a lot, I think, about how David chose, I think, or at least he taught us about it, how David chose Jerusalem. Yeah.
Rabbi Menachem Liebtag, in one of the classes about Yerushalayim, what he spoke is the fact that Yerushalayim was chosen by David HaMelech. The fact that it is between Shevet Yehuda and Shevet Binyamin. Shevet Yehuda representing Leah Imenu, Shevet Binyamin representing Rachel Imenu. So that's why this place is combined the two. That's why David HaMelech was able also to reign out of the 40 years, 33 years in Yerushalayim. and Hashem agreed with this motion. So it's really David HaMelech chose, and Hashem agreed.
No, that's very nice. Thank you.
Yes.
But David HaMelech chose it when the Malach was standing on top of him after he made the mistake of counting the people, and he had this big tzara on Bnei Israel. And then when Hashem accepted his korban, then he decided that this is the place where Beit HaMikdash is going to be built.
I didn't catch all of that.
And when David HaMelech wanted to bring a korban, when Hashem, because when there was a magifa after he counted the people, an unauthorized counting of the people,
Right.
and
Yeah.
and there was a big magifa in the land, and Rabbi HaMelech, the Malach was standing there, and he somehow he wanted to go into Givon and bring a korban, but somehow the Malach was leading him to Yerushalayim, and he brought a korban there and then the Hashem accepted the korban and forgave him, and that's when he said, "This is a place where Hashem accepts forgiveness," and he's going to make that. That's what he means. That's how I understood that Hashem wanted the Beit HaMikdash to be built there.
If I'm not mistaken, David HaMelech decided to do it much before that counting. Much before that, he has decided to do it. That story takes place to the end of the reign of David HaMelech.
But that's when he decided on Har HaBayit.
I'm not sure you're correct.
Okay, go back to it, you'll see.
Okay, we'll have to see how this debate ends. I'm gonna answer one
Yosef,
second.
okay, we'll give you the last question if
Oh man, all right, thanks. Okay. Okay, so one thing I was wondering is okay, according to the side that says that Bamot are good, but they detract from the centrality of the Mikdash, like I totally get that. For the side that says that like Bamot are inherently bad, but will like allow them under specific circumstances, do you have any thoughts on what the badness might be?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, part of it might be like someone was referring to, that it sort of is too hard to uproot. Like there's no way to successfully have Bamo and have one central place. I do think also that there is an idea of, you know, like we were speaking about with the Meiri, that when you're bringing sacrifices on your own, you're lacking in Brit, you're lacking in bringing them as part of the nation. But we could talk about that more. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. We'll let you go. Thank you very much, Dora. A
thank you,
pleasure. I hope you enjoyed.
Yeah, no, it was a great time. Yeah, thank you, everyone.
Okay, thank you for the discussion. Tomorrow morning, 9:15, my share on the Siddur, continue with the Amida. Please God, I'm sure everybody here got our schedule for our Elul Shiurim coming, our new Shiurim. If you haven't registered yet, please do so. We'll be switching, you know, the password soon, everything, all the login, but a bunch of new classes coming up. So look forward to that, and then we'll have our Yimei, which we haven't even advertised yet. That's not even included. We'll do before Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. So we look forward to learning with you. Everybody, wish you Shabbat Shalom, Besurat Tovot, good things, and enjoy. For those on the East Coast, I guess this is the unofficial last week of summer. So getting ready to go back to school. Those who have kids, grandkids, those who teach like me, after 9 weeks of vacation, I'm back in the classroom on Tuesday. So anyways, okay, everybody, Laila Tov, Shabbat Shalom, and be well. Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.